All right, let's get started here, guys. Good morning. My name is James Loperfido. I work in business development for a Japanese fintech company called Soramitsu. And today I'll be talking to you about our project, Bakong, which is a central bank digital currency and retail payment system that we created in conjunction with the National Bank of Cambodia, which is their central bank. Quickly about Soramitsu. Again, it's a Japanese fintech and blockchain engineering company founded in 2016 in Tokyo. We have offices and entities in Switzerland and a few other places throughout the world. About 50 engineers or so, and steadily growing. And we were one of the original contributors to the Hyperledger Iroha framework, which you guys, I'm sure, have heard a little bit about since you've been here at the Hyperledger Global Forum. And we contributed that in July of 2019, which is the first version, working on the second now. And as you can see, we have expertise in building blockchain implementations. We developed the C++ runtime environment for Polkadot, which is a utility for connecting blockchains to each other. And we have a few other projects in the digital asset space around custody of digital assets, creation, settlement, and a lot of the financial transactions and requirements for transition to a digital asset economy. Talk a little bit about Hyperledger Iroha. As you can see, it was open sourced in September of 2016. It was accepted into the Hyperledger project around the same time, but the first outside the incubation stage when it became recognized as a formal protocol within the greenhouse, again, was this past summer. It's known for embracing the Kaizen development principle. If you are familiar with Japanese culture, simplicity is elegance, and we try to maintain a simple user interface for both the technologists that are developing on it and anybody that would interact with the applications that we develop for our use case partners and enterprises that Iroha is the core foundation of. So it's very simple and fast, trying to keep it very lean. There's a focus on creating libraries for mobile applications and really focusing on consumer adoption and making that user experience as seamless and simple as possible, which if people have been following the blockchain space, we all know it's been a big hurdle to get applications out into the public and into the hands of consumers in a practical way. So Soramitsu really focuses on that side of the development through Iroha. You can see there's a list of use case partners here where we've proven some concepts through pilots. But as you'll see today, Bakong is probably our most valuable project in terms of its development and where we've taken it so far and where it could potentially go. So again, key domain expertise, creating infrastructure through Iroha using our Iroha as a foundation to create technology for digital currencies, assets, exchange, settlement, payments, and safekeeping. Again, if you're familiar with blockchain, you would know that digital identity and tying biometrics and identity to an application is the first step in creating user adoption for a practical implementation. And so I'll go over how we do that. But most importantly, in the case of Bakong, where people are using this technology to interact and trade and send money with each other, the most important thing is that they're able to do this by digital KYC and onboarding. So just through a mobile application, which I'll show you a demo of at the end of the presentation, people are able to register within the system and create a digital asset account that they could send and receive money through without actually having a bank account at a physical branch. So with certain limitations, people are able to transact without a physical bank account or having to go to a physical bank at all. And so we use specific things and define verifiable claims through matching someone's physical identity to a document, a state-issued document like a driver's license or passport. So again, just a little bit more of a summary of Hyperledger Iroha. It uses C++ as its primary language and focus, which allows for greater open source contribution. As you know, any of the Hyperledger greenhouse fabrics are open source, so enabling many people to contribute to the underlying source code is very important. There's a unique consensus and ordering service algorithms. It's Byzantine fault tolerant. I'm sure you've heard about the three generals problem in the past. If you haven't and you would like to learn about it, you could simply Google three generals or the double spending problem that Bitcoin and key pairing solved. Again, driving the idea of simplicity home, it has preordained command structure so that when we work with a partner like a bank, they don't have to recreate a library and set of instructions from scratch, and we have a lot of predetermined codes and commands that allow people to adapt or adopt the technology quickly and put it to use. And it has a modular design in that if we updated the consensus algorithm, for instance, we could plug it into an instance of Iroha within an application so that we could quickly adapt to the open source contributions that are made to the underlying framework. Again, identity is very important in how we not only maintain privacy, but make it easy for the user to engage with this system. And I'll just quickly talk about the partners before I get into the meat of the presentation here. But we work directly and were solicited by the National Bank of Cambodia to embed the blockchain-based retail payment system into their current banking software and built essentially all of the software to integrate with the central bank's existing and the commercial banks as well, existing infrastructure. We partner with Deloitte on the architecture for the system itself, KPMG as an auditor, and a recent partner in Tangem. Tangem creates a physical layer for private key management through very secure hardware, and also has other implications for identity and pretty specific use cases. So check them out. The CEO happens to be a good friend sitting here in the room with us. So what is Project Bakong? The goal of it was to create a digital currency that's usable by both financial institutions and the common populace in Cambodia. We tokenized versions of both the US dollar and the Cambodian riel, 100% asset backed, but in so doing created the opportunity for interoperability, not within just the commercial banks of Cambodia, but across countries as well, with the ultimate goal being to reduce the transaction fees of remittances. And when you have tokenized infrastructure within central banks or commercial banks, you're able to achieve frictionless payments, exchange, and relatively instantaneous settlements as well. So what's interesting about that is, if you're familiar with Cambodia at all, it's been pretty rife with struggle, civil discord, and has had its issues, and gained its independence from France in 1953. The Cambodian riel was introduced for a short period of time. When the Khmer Rouge took over the country, the Cambodian riel was actually taken with most money out of the circulation completely. It wasn't until, I believe, 1980 that the central bank was reestablished. And after the Paris Peace Treaty of 1991, the UN actually had one of the greatest transition impacts on the country, held and enforced elections, set up their own radio station, their own jail, and actually helped the country transition to a little bit more orderly state where some resemblance of democracy was able to persist. But In so doing, used the US dollar to create a strong foundation and stable currency for the country to use. That said, Cambodia's impetus now is to create a little bit more independence and reestablish the riel as a sovereign currency that they can use to foster a little bit more independence and confidence among the populace and the central bank and the country itself. The ability to have both a US dollar and Cambodian riel instance tokenized in this mobile wallet is a very important step in achieving that. That said, Shea Saray, the head of the central bank, wants to make sure that people are educated and not forced to make this decision. And so, she's publicly stated that she doesn't want to create a timeline for this, but absolutely educate and show people how to use this, their own currency to create commerce and open up the doors to, transaction, to be able to purchase things on the internet, which would be a huge step up in the economy itself. And there's obviously other huge implications to that. But peer-to-peer transaction is a big result. So again, Hyperledger Iroha comprises the basics of the system. Everything is built on top of that. But the requirements as put forward by the central bank when this project was created were a shared ledger that can be monitored by the central bank so that they have purview over at least the transactions in the country, if not the individuals that are transacting. They want an account-based model that would allow people to create a digital bank account with just a smartphone and a phone number, which is entirely possible and what we achieved there. A Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanism on a blockchain, multi-signature control so that if someone lost their private key, the commercial bank that they were associated with is able to regenerate it and allow them to recover their account. And also simplicity around the commands and scalability of the software that's integrated with both the central and commercial banks. It's adapted to their existing fast retail payment system. So there's different payment systems within a central bank. A retail gross settlement system is something that's used for large-scale payments between banks. But this system is focusing primarily on retail transactions in a peer-to-peer fashion, which we can get a little bit more granular with. But key features of the system are being able to execute and settle payment transactions in real time with settlement finality. So we got somewhere in between 1,000 and 2,000 transactions per second with settlement finality in under 5 seconds. And that could be a problem when you're considering maybe the whole world, for instance, right? But the population of Cambodia is roughly 15 million people. We have so far about 8,000 people using the payments platform itself right now through the commercial banks. But so far the system is holding up very well in terms of performance. Obviously it debit a sender's balance and credit receivers with an atomic execution of through the tokens in either the Cambodian riel or the US dollar, which obviously allows some decentralization in that the user owns their private key, but the central bank will maintain and operate the nodes to observe and create the transactions in the network. So yeah, just a little bit more on performance. Again, 5 seconds or less in terms of transaction and settlement with measured transaction throughput of 1,000 to 2,000 transactions per second, depending on the hardware configuration and where servers are and how things are stored. Obviously, there's crazy cost efficiency when you're able to reduce transaction fees from 2.5 and 20 for a typical credit card to nearly 0, which people generally understand is the kind of the direction that we're going. Cambodia was ranked, I believe, 6 on Basel's anti-money laundering index, which means that it's not exactly lacking corruption in terms of money laundering, which, as we all know, is a big problem. Up to $1.2 trillion a year is laundered in US dollars every year, and Cambodia is not ranking so well there. So in allowing the country to transition from dependence on the US paper fiat as primary currency to potentially a completely digital instance of both the US dollar and the Cambodian riel can be really valuable in terms of reducing corruption, money laundering, and also potentially tax evasion. It becomes very difficult to create monetary policy or collect taxes when you have no idea how the transactions are actually occurring in your country, given that 80% of them are happening with US paper dollars. And so KYC and AML done on the individual level, first digitally and then later physically at banks if transactions meet a certain daily threshold can be helpful there. So again, the potential economic impact for the country itself, you're allowing the Cambodian riel to regain some utility. Historically, it's been used only for small transactions with coins, because the country has had to rely on the dollar and its stability to create, some trust and stability and the transparency around the currencies and how they can be used will allow people to use the riel a little bit more often and hopefully gain some independence as a sovereign currency that way. So, historically the US dollar has allowed foreign direct investment because of the lack of Forex risk, but there's an impetus from the central bank to try and create a little bit more sovereignty. So I'll just show you guys an actual demo of the mobile application itself so you can see what it actually looks like. Typical crypto-looking wallet, if any of you guys have one. As you can see, there's an instance of both the Cambodian riel and the US dollar. You can send and receive a deposit at a bank or use a QR code to initiate a transaction. And everybody that's in your phone book that is registered in the system, you can easily send money to just by clicking their name, putting in the amount, and choosing the currency. Again, each of the currencies is 100% asset-backed. So, those reserves are held at the central bank. And obviously, these innovations beg a lot of questions in that what happens with M1 and M0 money when a citizen can hold an account directly with the central bank, right? So there's all sorts of political implications between, the central banks and the commercial banks and, what this means for savings and deposits. So as you can see, there's a record of the transaction once it's created. Again, settlement and transaction finality happens within 5 seconds. And again, all this information, with the exception of the identity of the individuals, is maintained within the central bank so that they have complete purview over how the transactions are happening, which allows them to not only potentially collect taxes in the future on these transactions, but also have some idea of how to plan for the economy, which is really important. And as you can see, if you were walking into a merchant or a store, you're able to quickly scan the QR code and send money directly and immediately for a transaction. And so that's a pretty good description of the mobile application itself. But to actually create a digital account right now, again, because 78% of the people 13 or older do not have access to a bank account, they can, with an existing phone number and smartphone, use just their face and match it to a document through the smartphone application to create a digital bank account through which they can transact up to, I believe it's $50 a day, without having to go and physically register and do full KYC and AML at a physical bank. So it'll allow people, especially people that live in more rural areas like farmers, to transact digitally and be able to purchase things both peer-to-peer and on the internet, which should create and stimulate quite a bit of commerce. And so you could see, generally what the wallet looks like and all of the information that would be captured when someone is onboarded. There's protection in terms of the biometrics, and that there's liveness detection so that it knows if it's a real person's face associated and matching to the physical document that they use to register. So there's a good degree of security with somewhere between 95 and 99% accuracy with respect to the biometrics that are recorded to prove that it's a real person and that the person is who they say they are when they create their account. And as I mentioned, there's account limits. People can top up their accounts at a physical bank location. And there's obviously also the potential for a central bank to issue money directly to its citizens, should that be an objective. That's a pretty good summary of the mobile payments app. And we have a couple of minutes for questions, it seems. So I would like to open the floor up to questions you guys might have about the project or the application or Soramitsu. Yeah. Oh, this project is entirely within the nation or kingdom of Cambodia. So in terms of the regulations there, obviously we have a direct relationship with the central bank and the entire system. They're also the regulator as well as the issuer of currency. So it was pretty easy for us to understand what the regulations impacted in terms of the technology and build out and software. Did you want to add on to that? Did you have another question? No. Yeah, right now, the nodes that allow the transactions are all hosted within the central bank physically. But there's opportunity to create relationships with not just central banks but also other commercial banks, so that if the tokenized infrastructure was compatible, people would be able to send payments across borders pretty easily and frictionlessly. Yeah.
What was your process like trying to engage the end user?
It's still very much ongoing and early in the project. It's definitely a challenge. There are digital banking businesses that are growing out from the existing commercial banks in Cambodia as well. So it's an education process as much as anything, but the central bank obviously has a vested interest in this becoming successful and widely usable. So they have marketing efforts, and if you guys wanted to check out the central bank's website for the project is bakong.mbc.org.kh, and there you can kind of see how they interact with the populace, at least on a digital forum. But there generally has to be almost a business around Bakong to really attract people to use the platform enough for it to be meaningful. And so it's going to be a very slow process. Again, Shea Saray herself in interviews has said that we don't want to force this upon people. But the reality is that people are used to seeing things priced in dollars. So to transition to using the Cambodian riel as a sovereign currency will take a long time, just because people's habits are so set in stone. But that's why the user interface and the mobile application and the right style custody of wallet is really important. Yeah.
What about the onboarding of their dollars into, from hard cash?
Yeah. Yeah, initially it has to be done at a commercial bank. unless the central bank directly issued to a wallet, which is possible, and they may do depending on policy and what their objectives are. But there's also the potential to just have ATMs or like a reverse ATM set up, which the technology obviously exists and it exists in countries now, but that generally. And one other implication of this that I hadn't thought about until this week was, paper money itself can hold, virus samples, right? So it's like we potentially get rid of epidemic issues using just digital money, but obviously the other implications are way more important. Yep. So the central bank is already directly coordinating with Malaysia and their central bank to create compatible infrastructure using Bakong or similar software. We're also in talks with the Central Bank of Thailand to make sure that everything is interoperable, because those are two big partners in terms of cross-border payments and remittances.
What is the biggest obstacle for your side?
There's managing, language barriers, a lot of the more practical things, right? Making sure that the user interfaces are simple for people to use, so that they don't have to retrain the entire banking staff on new processes. So that was a big part of the system architecture, is making sure that it integrated well with the existing banking infrastructure, so that there's as few hurdles to adoption as possible. There's political obstacles, there's social obstacles, there's scaling obstacles. But I would say probably the most important thing is making sure that people can actually use it, right? As I mentioned earlier, that's been a huge issue in the blockchain space, right? The underlying technology is valuable, as we all know, but making sure that the consumer can adopt what applications are created using blockchain has been an issue, and that's definitely been the focus here with this project.
Can you tell us anything about adoption in real world, transactions per day, monthly average users?
There's 8,000 people actually transacting in the system right now. I don't have data right now on how many transactions or the volume. I could get it, but it's significant enough for us to understand kind of flows and issues and how people are actually using it. But I can definitely follow up with a little bit more data.
How have you seen that change over time? Is it growing really fast? Is it really
It's gonna be slow and steady. They started with I think 3 commercial banks participating in the system, distributing it to their customers, and now they're up to 9, which includes Aklida, which is the biggest bank in Cambodia. And so it's scaling slowly and surely, but 8,000 over 15 million is not very much penetration, right? It's still very early.
But it's real world.
It's real world. It's working. People are transacting in it, so that's pretty good for this style project.
Is there a notion of signing over transactions? And if so, where are the keys stored?
So the individuals own their private keys. The commercial banks have multi-sig authority to recover private keys if someone lost it. There's potential to change that. But the central bank does not have access to who those individuals are specifically. Their identity is not tied to their account as far as the central bank knows.
You just mentioned that in the future, the user may own his own key,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which would mean that the user will not have to have an account at a commercial bank.
Correct.
Right? Now, you understand what's going to happen.
Correct. Yeah. There's all sorts of potential there, right? Yeah, it's a fundamental shift when M0 could replace M1, right? And it begs a lot of consternation around why a commercial bank deposit or savings account is needed at all, right? So there's right.
What does the Cambodian central bank say about this?
I'm not exactly sure what their public stance on is immediately. Obviously, through cooperating with the existing commercial banking infrastructure, they're cognizant of that and want to ensure that order is maintained. I think there's reason enough to maintain the structure as is so that there's a degree of privacy and anonymity in such that the central bank, like I said, doesn't have complete access to the account holders and their personal information, but they can see all the transactions, right? So say there was a crime that needed to be investigated, they would have to work with the commercial banks to go through, the KYC and AML identity data for a specific individual, but it still allows the central bank to monitor transactions at scale and be able to better plan for the economy.
Is the network public? Can anyone see the transaction?
No.
Only the bank?
Right now, only the central bank can see all of the transactions. The commercial banks can view transactions amongst their customers. But the interesting part is that all digital bank account holders, like say it was just a blockchain-based account, can transact with any other bank account and vice versa. So the transactions are universal and as if you had your own bank account.
The central bank is your client,
Yes.
which makes it a government app.
Yes.
What if the government of Cambodia wanted to add on voting or surveillance components or somehow expand it in new directions that may or may not match your values as a company?
Well, I mean, that's a decision that the company would have to make, right, in terms of whether or not they wanted to participate. But I think the idea generally is that the central bank understands that trust and transparency has been an issue, right? And that's why there hasn't been widespread adoption of the riel in the first place. So, their objective is to create stability and trust. So I don't think that they have much motivation to kind of move in the more surveillance type of direction. But, it's difficult to tell where these things are headed. But I think that generally the citizenry doesn't want that stuff to happen and, could easily opt out.
How does this compare to other CBDC projects like
I'm not 100% informed on Riksbank or the Swedish e-krona. There's obviously everybody's looking at this right now. It's definitely a buzzword, right? This is what's called a retail semi-centralized digital currency, in that again the nodes are located within the central bank, yet there is some degree of self-sovereignty with private ownership of the keys and the ability to transact peer-to-peer without an intermediary. So it's a little bit of a hybrid that way, but it also allows for potential to be even further decentralized should that be the right recipe down the road.
This is the token movement, so it gets issued by a central bank to a bank, and then the bank moves that to a customer's wallet, and then a customer pays another customer, so that token moves across. Is that put back into the bank? So it sits in their wallet, but you were saying there's a balance adjustment on accounts. So do they literally have a certain dollar value that's only maintained in tokens on their phone, and then that's subtracted from their balance? And then, oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. So again, it's the tokens are 100% asset-backed, right? So initially, for a consumer to top up their account, they would have to deposit physical cash, which is de facto what people use now, right? So they say they had $5 that they wanted to convert to a digital instance of either the riel or the dollar. They would have to go to a bank, make a physical deposit, and then their digital account would be topped up with tokens. So those tokens are minted at the point of deposit, I believe. I'm not sure exactly what the monetary policy will look like going forward, or how they will issue new tokens in the future. Generally that's how it works right now.
So who issues who?
The central bank.
Okay, so the
Central
bank
bank,
takes it on deposit.
Yep.
Then they tell the central bank we've
Yep.
received this.
Yes.
How do they adjust the fact that the bank holds?
So the commercial banks will have a very similar type of account that interacts with the system in a much similar way that an individual consumer account would work.
Settle somehow.
Yeah, but it's rapid.
Yeah. Okay.
And then transactions peer to peer don't need any intermediary account.
Okay.
So I'm sorry if I misunderstood. You say the central bank runs all the nodes?
Yes, for the time being.
Time being. But
Yeah.
who else is going to run the nodes?
Potentially the commercial banks themselves, I guess.
Because you agree, if that doesn't happen, there's not much point of
There's debate about whether or not that degree of decentralization has any utility whatsoever, but the real utility, at least initially, comes in the form of people being able to transact that otherwise didn't have a physical or didn't have a bank account at all, right? So with just a smartphone and a phone number, at least they can have a bank account with minimal KYC done through their phone. So that's really the core innovation that is allowing more commerce.
Yeah, but that doesn't require blockchain.
No, it does not. But I would argue that the security inherent in that structure is valuable as well.
It's the idea that you move past payments into DVP eventually, then, which would
Very, very likely, yeah. Yeah. And I think really the value in the grand scheme of things, right, is that there's potential interoperability with tokenized infrastructure in other countries, right? And also the potential for these people to just use their app to buy things on the internet, right? If 90% of your commerce is U.S. physical dollars, it makes it very difficult to buy things online. Yep. Last question.
If it happens that the other banks will start participating, will the privacy will still be preserved, or are the other banks also going to see all the transactions on the network?
Other banks in other countries, you mean, or?
No, if commercial banks
Right.
start
Yeah.
participating in the network, will
Yep.
they see all the transactions?
So right now they can only see transactions of customers that are part of that bank. So when you first sign up, you have to choose a particular commercial bank that you want to associate your account with, and they, for KYC and AML purposes, have to have access to that. But right now the central bank does not know individually who is transacting, and that's probably going to be maintained. But right now there's already 8 commercial banks using it, and they only have access to their customers.
If they run a node,
Mm-hmm.
would they have access to everything?
I think that all depends on policy and what they intend to do, but I would think not. It all depends. But the system is flexible such that those things can be changed. Whether or not there's an impetus to, that's for the central bank to decide. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.